The date is September 22nd, 1999. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis just released to rave reviews and strong sales, and one thing was abundantly clear. PlayStation was the home of Resident Evil. It was one of those instances where a game series becomes indelibly associated with one platform or brand, even if it wasn't truly an exclusive. Resident Evil and Resident Evil 2 both had ports to other consoles and to PC, but like other franchises like Metal Gear Solid and Ridge Racer, the court of public opinion had already made their ruling. If you wanted the best shot at playing every game Resident Evil had to offer, it was your best bet to invest in a PlayStation. But right as the next generation of consoles was beginning, Capcom decided to go and sign a deal with Nintendo to make the GameCube the official home of Resident Evil for the foreseeable future. It was a deal that was supposed to shake the gaming world to its core, and it did, at least for a little bit. How's it going, everyone? My name is Evan, and I am, in fact, talking about Resident Evil again. It's one of my all-time favorite game franchises, and I grew up playing Resident Evil 2 and 3 on the GameCube, and this is how I fell in love with the series. But when I was recollecting these games on GameCube and eventually the full Resident Evil set, I found myself wrapped up in the backstory of this whole very strange era of Resident Evil and Nintendo history. So that's what I'm here to talk about today. If you guys enjoy game discussions like this, it would really go a long way if you can just hit that like button. It helps this channel a ton. And if you enjoy video game discussions or Resident Evil talk, hit subscribe and join up with the channel. I also am a huge game collector, so if you like that kind of stuff, we do a lot of that here too. But with that out of the way, let's start at the very beginning. Launching on April Fool's Day 1996, the original Resident Evil hit only for the PlayStation 1, and as we know, it was a runaway success. The game was just perfect for Sony's hardware and audience.
Resident Evil.
At the time, no other platform could push polygons quite like the PS1. The Saturn was, well, temperamental when it came to 3D, and the N64 wasn't even out yet, so can't have that one. Developers said the PlayStation was the best place to make their vision into a reality.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
And yeah, they nailed it. This decision set a precedent for what would be the rest of the generation. Resident Evil 1 had 3 independent versions come out on the PS1. The original, the Director's Cut, and the Director's Cut DualShock Edition. You know, the one with the bad music. Resident Evil 2 had 2 releases, the original and the ensuing DualShock Edition. Resident Evil 3 only had 1 version, because it was perfect the first time around. That can mean many things, and I intend it to do so. And Resident Evil Survivor is Resident Evil Survivor. It ain't great, but honestly, I love it. It's just lovably mediocre. All in all, the series sold over 10 million copies worldwide for the original PlayStation. But that doesn't mean these games never saw ports or Resident Evil didn't appear on other hardware. There was a real effort from Capcom at the time to bring Resident Evil wherever they could. RE1 eventually got that port to the Saturn. Resident Evil 2 hit the N64 and the Dreamcast in 1999, and Nemesis made the jump to Dreamcast a year later. But still, all of that mattered very little. Sony's platform was the place to play RE. You can enjoy every single release, and the sales numbers absolutely backed it all up. But just months after the launch of the PlayStation 2, Capcom decided to flip everything on its head. September 13th, 2001. Resident Evil director Shinji Mikami gets up on stage in front of the Japanese gaming press, and he unveiled a new logo for the series and pulled back the curtain on his latest project. It's not Resident Evil 4, but a complete ground-up remake of the original game. He showed off the game's improved backgrounds. They were still pre-rendered, but looked great. There was new 3D models and a brand new impressive lighting engine. Mikami said it was a challenge to get everything up and running and looking so good, but the talented folks over at Nintendo helped him and his team get it all running on the about-to-be-released GameCube. Then, Mikami changed his tune. He directly addressed why they picked the GameCube as the lead console for the remake's development. And he started talking about his concerns with the PlayStation 2 and integrating DVD player technology into video game consoles. In a translated press release, he said in part, quote, "The current mainstream DVD plus game environment presents a complex environment for creating the games that craftsmen strive for. If the quality of playability is not properly balanced, the very existence of the game itself will disappear into the video work." Questionable statement or not, Mikami had made up his mind. He announced a wide-ranging but not complete exclusivity deal with Nintendo, making GameCube the new home of Resident Evil going forward. 3 brand new games would lead the charge: Resident Evil Remake, Resident Evil 0, which started its life as an N64 project already, and the next numbered mainline entry, Resident Evil 4. And to make sure GameCube players could get the entire story, ports of 2, 3, and Code Veronica were also announced for the GameCube. And joining Mikami on stage for all of this, Nintendo's main man himself, Shigeru Miyamoto. He was a guest speaker at the event, and he and Mikami posed for pictures. For a series that was only 5 years old, this was a major announcement. They had the most important figure in gaming history on stage with them, and make no mistake, this shocked everybody. At the time, IGN headlined the move as a shocker, writing, quote, "In the video game world, Capcom's agreement with Nintendo is in many ways unprecedented." They questioned just exactly how long this deal would last, adding, quote, "It was the PlayStation that was so strongly associated with Resident Evil, and it was on the PlayStation that it gained almost all of its fame." But both sides saw a huge upside in the deal anyway. A Capcom rep told IGN in that same article, "Capcom has a huge amount of faith in Nintendo. Nintendo knows it needs the older demographic, and the basic reason that we've decided to work with Nintendo with this series has nothing to do with Sony at all. It has everything to do with Nintendo. It's about where we see GameCube going." They also told PS2 players not to be sad because they still had Devil May Cry and Onimusha. I don't know how much better that made people feel, but there it was. And so it all began, the era of Resident Evil on GameCube. Resident Evil Remake launched in March of 2002 to near universal acclaim. It got rave reviews and is generally considered one of the best in the franchise and one of the best remakes ever, starting a trend the series would continue later in its life. Resident Evil 0 followed that same year in November. Reviews were good, but not to the level of Remake. The whole game is centered on a zipping, swapping mechanic between 2 characters, Rebecca and Billy. And there's some weird things about this game that just kind of get under my skin. Like, why did they remove the item boxes? It breaks item management. Resident Evil 2 and 3 both saw ports to the Cube in January of 2003, the next year. I found a bunch of conflicting information, but it appears these 2 games came out within days of each other, but not on the same day. Otherwise, these are straight up PS1 ports, except for the voiceover at the beginning.
Resident Evil 2. Resident Evil 2.
I don't know, Capcom must have really liked this guy because he did the title screen for every release on the system. Code Veronica X must have felt pretty late when it released in December of 2003. That's 3 years after the Dreamcast original and 2 years after it came to PS2, before this whole deal was ironed out. And finally, in January of 2005, we got Resident Evil 4. This game was also included in that legendary Capcom 5 agreement, and while it did help affirm relations with Nintendo for reasons I'll talk about later, for this video's purposes, that deal remains largely irrelevant. Remember, RE4 was in that original 2001 deal, so this was nothing new that the game was coming to GameCube. Despite that, Resident Evil 4 blew the gaming world away. It was a truly revolutionary, amazing experience, game-changing game, yada yada, whatever, you know how good this game is. But most importantly, it was a GameCube exclusive for all of 9 months. You see, in the time that it takes to nurture a full-term pregnancy, Resident Evil 4 went from a GameCube exclusive to launching on the PlayStation 2 with exclusive new content. But really, the problem started way before conception, and Capcom absolutely knew it.
As you can see by this graph,
Resident Evil wasn't selling on GameCube. Not at all. This graphic from IGN shows the series' sales numbers through November of 2003. This is right before Code Veronica came out and before Resident Evil 4. Remake and Zero both failed to eclipse the 500,000 mark. And the 2 PS1 ports, well, the demand just wasn't there straight up, full stop. A meager 41,000 for Resident Evil 3 and 32,000 for Resident Evil 2. Remember, Code Veronica was set to release the following month, and judging by the game's absurd price on the secondhand market today, it's fair to wonder if CVX somehow managed to sell even worse than 2. You can speculate that Nintendo's audience just didn't have the appetite for survival horror, but really, by 2003, the difference in install base between the PS2 and the GameCube was already massive. The GameCube had sold around 10 million units. The PS2 was at least 5 times ahead of that. Investors for Capcom weren't happy. They couldn't have been. But this was a fact that Capcom was aware of. Not long after the deal with Nintendo, the terms were modified and non-numbered Resident Evil games were cleared for release on other platforms. People had legitimate questions when Capcom announced Outbreak for the PS2 in 2002. The Capcom 5 deal eventually helped them save face when it came to their relationship with Nintendo. Dead Aim, Outbreak File 2, and a Japan-only Survivor sequel would also hit the PS2 a couple years later. But the end of it all came on November 1st, 2004. In the weeks leading up to Resident Evil 4's release, Capcom announced that the game would only be exclusive to the Cube for just a few months, and a PS2 port was dated for the end of 2005. Capcom said in that release, "We have come to this conclusion after deliberating over customers' needs, market environments, and various opinions from stakeholders such as shareholders or investors." There it is. And from there, that was pretty much it. 4 was the last Resident Evil game that would ever release for 6th generation consoles, and the game sold best on PS2. After that, Resident Evil kept it multi-plat. Resident Evil 5 launched day and date on Xbox 360 and PS3, and I love this game, I don't care what anyone says. As for Nintendo, Capcom did support them as well as they could. Obviously, they couldn't release Resident Evil 5 on the Wii, so they followed up with ports of Zero and Resident Evil Remake, a port of RE4 with the added content from the PS2 version, and we also got 2 rail shooters, Resident Evil The Umbrella Chronicles and Resident Evil The Darkside Chronicles. All in all, I wouldn't say there are too many lasting impacts of the exclusivity deal with Nintendo. Once it dissolved, that was pretty much it. Capcom didn't rush to take corrective measures, and they still kept things decently close with Nintendo. I guess the biggest result of the deal was Remake and Zero never appearing on a PlayStation console until 2015, when they finally got HD ports to modern consoles on digital storefronts. And that pretty much brings us to where we are today. The GameCube versions remain mostly collector's items just due to the fact that you can play a lot of these games other places and they will not cost as much. They're all relatively solid ports. Even with modern HD versions available, there's still valid ways to play all of these games. However, Resident Evil 2, 3, and especially Code Veronica X demand high resale prices, and you can play them elsewhere for a lot less. Resident Evil 0 and Remake have generally low prices between the $20 to $30 range. 2 and 3 stay around the low 90s to about $100, $110. Code Veronica, much higher. I don't know how many copies this game sold, but there's obviously very limited stock. You're going to expect to pay around $170 to $180. And Resident Evil 4 is very common. You'll probably pay about $20 to $30 for it. If you're a collector, these are a cool set to grab on the GameCube. However, they're certainly not the most necessary, and you can play these games other ways for much less money. Maybe we'll see all of the Resident Evil games make the jump to Nintendo Switch Online, but considering Capcom's tendency to remake and remaster games, I highly doubt we see that. Anyway, guys, that's pretty much it for this video. A little bit of a different format for me, but again, I was really intrigued with this history. And this is the fun part about game collecting, is that you get to dig in on topics like this. If you enjoyed this video, again, I would appreciate it if you hit that like button and subscribe for more game discussions and collecting content. My name is Evan. I hope you enjoyed, and have a good one, everybody.